Beneath every line of history, there are pages that were never meant to be read. Across deserts, mountains, and forgotten monasteries, fragments of one book kept resurfacing, copied by quiet hands, hidden again and carried forward through time. It spoke of angels who descended before kings ruled, of calendars written in light, and of a man who walked with beings that mapped the stars. His name was Enoch, and his story vanished from the Bible, but not from memory. What was once sealed in stone, banned from scripture, and erased from the timeline has returned. It challenges what we think we know about creation, judgment, and the origins of human knowledge itself. Tonight, we follow the trail of a forbidden text that refused to disappear, the book that claimed to know the sky before science did, and the man who wrote it down. Join us as we open Enoch's banned chapters. Why this book threatened the official timeline. The Watchers who descended. In the dry hills of Qumran in 1947, a Bedouin shepherd named Muhammad Ed-Dib tossed a stone into a small cave and heard the sound of pottery breaking. Inside, he found scrolls sealed for nearly 2,000 years. Among them lay fragments of an ancient text long whispered about but missing from the accepted Bible, the Book of Enoch. Written in a language older than Hebrew tradition itself, it described the descent of celestial beings, the birth of forbidden knowledge, and an age that predated the story of Genesis. The Book of Enoch was not new when it was found. Early Christian and Jewish scholars once treated it as authentic scripture. Fragments of it had circulated among priests and mystics from Alexandria to Ethiopia. The text, attributed to Enoch, the great-grandfather of Noah, claimed to record visions shown to a human who walked with beings not of this earth. Enoch was said to have been taken up into the heavens, where he saw the structure of creation itself, the movement of the stars, and the judgment of those called Watchers. The Watchers were said to be angels sent to guide early humans, but as Enoch wrote, they descended upon Mount Hermon in the days of Jared, around a time when men began to multiply upon the face of the earth. There were 200 of them, led by one named Semjaza. Their mission was not destruction, but observation. Yet something changed. The Watchers began to desire the daughters of men. They took them as wives, teaching them secrets of heaven, metallurgy, astronomy, writing, and enchantments. These gifts, according to Enoch, gave rise to corruption. Their children, called the Nephilim, became giants who consumed the earth's resources and turned against mankind. In the accepted canon, Genesis briefly mentions these beings. There were giants in the earth in those days, but Enoch's account expands it into a chronicle of rebellion. It details how knowledge once meant for the divine was passed to mortals too early. It names each angel and the forbidden craft he taught Azazel, teaching weapons and warfare, Sariel revealing the courses of the moon, Barkel instructing in astrology. It is a catalogue of civilization's first sciences, given not by human discovery, but by transgression. Scholars believe parts of the Book of Enoch were written between the 3rd century BCE and the 1st century BCE, perhaps in Aramaic. The oldest fragments found among the Dead Sea Scrolls match that period. Yet, early church fathers such as Tertullian and Justin Martyr accepted it as genuine revelation. It was even quoted directly in the Epistle of Jude, which speaks of Enoch, the 7th from Adam. This single citation anchored the book's authority in early Christianity. But by the 4th century CE, it began to disappear from Western scripture. The Council of Laodicea, convened around 363 CE, quietly excluded it from the canon. Later, the influential Bishop Athanasius confirmed its removal, listing only the 66 books we now recognize. In their view, the Book of Enoch was too strange, its cosmology incompatible with emerging doctrine. Heaven was no longer a layered mechanism with gates and winds and chambers of stars. Angels were no longer fallible. The story of divine rebellion was rewritten into something simpler, a single fall, a single adversary. In Ethiopia, however, the book remained untouched. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church preserved the complete text in Ge'ez, its ancient liturgical language. There it survived, passed from monk to monk, century after century. When the Scottish explorer James Bruce returned from Ethiopia in 1773 with several copies, Europe was astonished. Until then, Western scholars believed the book lost forever. It was translated into English in 1821 by Richard Lawrence, then Archbishop of Cashel. What they read disturbed them. The Book of Enoch described a universe where the sky was mechanical, where stars were living entities bound to laws, and where time itself was cyclical. It spoke of the storehouses of the winds and the prison of the stars, images that hinted at astronomy, meteorology, and something more. It described Enoch being shown the ends of the earth where the vault of heaven rests, a cosmology predating both Greek and biblical models. Some modern researchers note parallels between Enoch's vision and Mesopotamian myths, particularly those of the Apkallu, semi-divine beings who also descended to teach humanity. Others point to parallels in the Epic of Gilgamesh, whose flood narrative mirrors Enoch's warnings of corruption before the deluge. The idea of celestial visitors bringing knowledge to primitive humanity reappears in cultures from Sumer to Mesoamerica. Enoch's text, in this sense, connects them all. In the 20th century, translations revealed more complexity. The so-called Book of the Watchers is only the first section. Later parts include astronomical books, parables, and prophecies. One section, the Book of Luminaries, describes the movement of the sun and moon in degrees and portals language that mirrors the observational precision of early Babylonian astronomers. Another section, the Book of Dreams, predicts a sequence of empires using animal imagery, echoing apocalyptic literature that would later appear in Daniel and Revelation. Why was this text banned? For centuries, religious scholars avoided direct explanations. Some argued it was pseudepigrapha, written under a false name. Others said its depiction of angels contradicted established theology. But there is another possibility. Enoch presented a version of prehistory that placed humanity in contact with higher beings long before the accepted timeline of civilization. It implied that advanced knowledge once existed and was deliberately suppressed after the flood. In 1893, the French Orientalist Charles Bonnet wrote, "Enoch's book is not a heresy, it is a memory of something the world has forgotten." His statement was quickly dismissed, yet the idea persists among researchers who see in Enoch's text the echo of a lost scientific epoch, a civilization erased, its knowledge repackaged as myth. Today, fragments of Enoch's story appear in nearly every ancient tradition: the flood of Noah, the fall of angels, the mystery of the Nephilim. Each retelling seems like a broken shard from the same origin. What remains unclear is whether the book was ever meant to be read by ordinary eyes. Some early rabbis claimed its knowledge was dangerous. The Talmud mentions a warning: "He who reads the book of Enoch, his years shall be shortened." Yet the text survived. From the caves of Qumran to the mountains of Ethiopia, from parchment to translation, it endured as a silent witness to an alternate timeline, a version of history where the line between heaven and earth was once open. The sky that was divided. In the pages of the Book of Enoch, there is a journey unlike any other preserved in ancient scripture. Enoch describes being carried upward, not in spirit, but in body, by luminous beings who took him to a structure of heaven that functioned like a vast machine. It was divided into levels, each ruled by different forces, each designed with precise order. This was not the poetic heaven of later theology, but a mapped, measurable realm. Enoch writes of being shown the chambers of light and the boundaries of the winds. He saw the gates through which the stars emerge and return, the storehouses where snow and rain were kept, and the places where thunder was stored before it was released. The text calls these portals, a word that modern readers find peculiar, yet it recurs more than 20 times in the manuscript. It suggests motion, regulation, and repetition the sky as a system, not a mystery. When fragments of this astronomical book were first translated from Ge'ez into English in the early 19th century, scholars noticed something extraordinary. The calculations within the text degrees, days, and seasonal divisions appeared more accurate than those of contemporary Babylonian astronomy. Enoch describes a solar year of 364 days, divided into 4 equal quarters of 91 days each. It seems wrong by modern reckoning, yet its structure allowed the same calendar to repeat endlessly, maintaining harmony between the lunar and solar cycles. To the priests of the Second Temple period, this was not myth, but mathematics. The Qumran community, often linked to the Essenes, copied this section repeatedly. Fragments of it were found in Cave 4, each written in steady Aramaic script. They placed immense importance on timekeeping, seeing it as a sacred rhythm between heaven and earth. If time fell out of alignment, they believed, humanity would drift from divine order. Enoch's sky was not symbolic, it was a clock that governed all life. The text describes how Enoch was taken to the ends of the earth to observe where the firmament touched the mountains. He wrote of 12 gates in the east and 12 in the west, through which the sun and moon passed daily. Each gate corresponded to a specific season and duration of light. The sun, he was told, entered through one gate in the spring and returned through another in winter. The moon followed similar but offset paths, a primitive but clear record of celestial procession. For modern astronomers, the detail is curious. The idea of the sun passing through portals might be metaphorical, yet the intervals of daylight given in the text match what would occur at specific latitudes. Some researchers, like Joseph Milik of the École Biblique in Jerusalem, proposed that Enoch's sky model was based on real observation, possibly from the Levant or northern Mesopotamia, around 300 BCE. Others suggested it encoded an older system, perhaps Sumerian in origin, where ziggurats doubled as observatories aligned to the solstices. The Book of Luminaries, as it came to be known, was not merely astronomy. It was cosmography, a structured map of the universe. Enoch names the angel Uriel as his guide, who is over the world and the Tartarus. Uriel explains the cycles of day and night, the function of the stars, and the punishment of those who deviate from their appointed paths. To Enoch, every celestial motion had moral weight. The stars themselves were said to be living beings, bound to obey the laws of their creator. Those that did not were cast into the prison of stars, a phrase scholars still debate. Some interpret it as an allegory for comets or fallen angels, others as a forgotten myth of stellar decay. In the Greek world of the same era, philosophers like Aristotle and Hipparchus were developing similar ideas about a layered cosmos, yet Enoch's account predates them. His firmament was not made of crystal spheres, but of pillars of heaven, immense columns that held up a vault above the waters. Between these pillars moved winds, each governed by an angel. There were 4 winds bringing blessings, and 4 that brought destruction, an early taxonomy of weather phenomena. In one passage, Enoch writes, "I saw the paths of the angels, how they measured the sun's chariots." The language is poetic, but the intent is observational. It describes a cosmos, both mechanical and sacred, where movement itself was proof of divine order. Later texts, like the Book of Jubilees and the Testament of Levi, borrowed directly from this imagery, suggesting that Enoch's vision shaped Jewish and early Christian cosmology more than most realize. By the time of the 1st century BCE, the Enochian calendar had become controversial. Temple authorities in Jerusalem used a lunar calendar tied to Babylonian tradition. The sects who followed Enoch's 364-day solar year accused them of corrupting time itself. To them, worship on the wrong day meant rebellion against heaven's rhythm. The sky that was divided became the origin of schism. This quiet battle over calendars may explain why Enoch's texts were hidden in caves and excluded from later scripture. They carried not only forbidden cosmology, but a rival system of sacred time. When later scribes codified Genesis, they simplified the heavens into a single firmament, erasing the portals and chambers. The order of creation was flattened into metaphor. The detailed machinery of the sky, its gears and cycles, was forgotten. Yet Enoch's divided sky endured through preservation rather than acceptance. In Ethiopia's highland monasteries, monks still recited fragments of it during the spring equinox. In those chants, the year began, not with a feast or decree, but with the alignment of gates, when the sun entered the first portal and balance returned to the world. For those who study ancient astronomy today, Enoch's vision is a puzzle that bridges science and myth. It preserves a memory of structured observation from a world that was supposed to be primitive, a sky that was not imagined, but measured, the sky that was divided. In the pages of the Book of Enoch, there is a journey unlike any other preserved in ancient scripture. Enoch describes being carried upward, not in spirit, but in body, by luminous beings who took him to a structure of heaven that functioned like a vast machine. It was divided into levels, each ruled by different forces, each designed with precise order. This was not the poetic heaven of later theology, but a mapped, measurable realm. Enoch writes of being shown the chambers of light and the boundaries of the winds. He saw the gates through which the stars emerge and return, the storehouses where snow and rain were kept, and the places where thunder was stored before it was released. The text calls these portals, a word that modern readers find peculiar, yet it recurs more than 20 times in the manuscript. It suggests motion, regulation, and repetition, the sky as a system, not a mystery. When fragments of this astronomical book were first translated from Ge'ez into English in the early 19th century, scholars noticed something extraordinary. The calculations within the text degrees, days, and seasonal divisions appeared more accurate than those of contemporary Babylonian astronomy. Enoch describes a solar year of 364 days, divided into 4 equal quarters of 91 days each. It seems wrong by modern reckoning, yet its structure allowed the same calendar to repeat endlessly, maintaining harmony between the lunar and solar cycles. To the priests of the Second Temple period, this was not myth, but mathematics. The Qumran community, often linked to the Essenes, copied this section repeatedly. Fragments of it were found in Cave 4, each written in steady Aramaic script. They placed immense importance on timekeeping, seeing it as a sacred rhythm between heaven and earth. If time fell out of alignment, they believed, humanity would drift from divine order. Enoch's sky was not symbolic. It was a clock that governed all life. The text describes how Enoch was taken to the ends of the earth to observe where the firmament touched the mountains. He wrote of 12 gates in the east and 12 in the west, through which the sun and moon passed daily. Each gate corresponded to a specific season and duration of light. The sun, he was told, entered through one gate in the spring and returned through another in winter. The moon followed similar but offset paths, a primitive but clear record of celestial procession. For modern astronomers, the detail is curious. The idea of the sun passing through portals might be metaphorical, yet the intervals of daylight given in the text match what would occur at specific latitudes. Some researchers, like Joseph Milik of the École Biblique in Jerusalem, proposed that Enoch's sky model was based on real observation, possibly from the Levant or northern Mesopotamia around 300 BCE. Others suggested it encoded an older system, perhaps Sumerian in origin, where ziggurats doubled as observatories aligned to the solstices. The Book of Luminaries, as it came to be known, was not merely astronomy. It was cosmography, a structured map of the universe. Enoch names the angel Uriel as his guide, who is over the world and the Tartarus. Uriel explains the cycles of day and night, the function of the stars, and the punishment of those who deviate from their appointed paths. To Enoch, every celestial motion had moral weight. The stars themselves were said to be living beings, bound to obey the laws of their creator. Those that did not were cast into the prison of stars, a phrase scholars still debate. Some interpret it as an allegory for comets or fallen angels, others as a forgotten myth of stellar decay. In the Greek world of the same era, philosophers like Aristotle and Hipparchus were developing similar ideas about a layered cosmos, yet Enoch's account predates them. His firmament was not made of crystal spheres, but of pillars of heaven, immense columns that held up a vault above the waters. Between these pillars moved winds, each governed by an angel. There were 4 winds bringing blessings, and 4 that brought destruction, an early taxonomy of weather phenomena. In one passage, Enoch writes, "I saw the paths of the angels, how they measured the sun's chariots." The language is poetic, but the intent is observational. It describes a cosmos both mechanical and sacred, where movement itself was proof of divine order. Later, texts like the Book of Jubilees and the Testament of Levi borrowed directly from this imagery, suggesting that Enoch's vision shaped Jewish and early Christian cosmology more than most realize. By the time of the 1st century BCE, the Enochian calendar had become controversial. Temple authorities in Jerusalem used a lunar calendar tied to Babylonian tradition. The sects who followed Enoch's 364-day solar year accused them of corrupting time itself. To them, worship on the wrong day meant rebellion against heaven's rhythm. The sky that was divided became the origin of schism. This quiet battle over calendars may explain why Enoch's texts were hidden in caves and excluded from later scripture. They carried not only forbidden cosmology, but a rival system of sacred time. When later scribes codified Genesis, they simplified the heavens into a single firmament, erasing the portals and chambers. The order of creation was flattened into metaphor. The detailed machinery of the sky, its gears and cycles, was forgotten. Yet Enoch's divided sky endured through preservation rather than acceptance. In Ethiopia's highland monasteries, monks still recited fragments of it during the spring equinox. In those chants, the year began not with a feast or decree, but with the alignment of gates when the sun entered the first portal and balance returned to the world. For those who study ancient astronomy today, Enoch's vision is a puzzle that bridges science and myth. It preserves a memory of structured observation from a world that was supposed to be primitive, a sky that was not imagined but measured, the giants beneath the flood. In the second section of the Book of Enoch, the tone shifts from observation to warning. Enoch's calm record of the heavens gives way to accounts of beings that no longer fit within the world's new boundaries. These are the Nephilim, the offspring of the Watchers, and the daughters of men described as giants, born in defiance of divine order. Their story lies between myth and memory, recorded in fragments that echo through ancient texts from Mesopotamia to Canaan. According to Enoch, the Nephilim were immense in both stature and appetite. They consumed what humans grew, then turned to devour the people themselves. Their presence filled the earth with violence, forcing Enoch to act as a messenger between the fallen angels and the Creator. In the narrative, Enoch pleads for mercy on their behalf, but the answer he receives is absolute. "You have defiled the earth with your deeds and revealed eternal secrets that were preserved in heaven. The Watchers are condemned to the abyss, and their hybrid children are destroyed by the flood that follows." The flood in Genesis is familiar, but in Enoch's version it is personal. It is a deliberate erasure of bloodlines that linked heaven and earth. The flood is not sent for human sin alone. It is sent to cleanse what should not have existed. In one verse, the archangel Uriel tells Enoch to warn Noah, For the waters shall come upon the earth, and all that is upon it shall be destroyed. It places Enoch, not Noah, as the first to receive the warning. The Nephilim, though annihilated, leave behind remnant spirits without bodies, condemned to wander the earth as evil spirits. This passage later shaped early Jewish and Christian demonology. It proposed that demonic forces were not fallen angels, but the disembodied offspring of forbidden unions. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, a similar term, Rephaim, appears to describe shades of ancient giants haunting the ruins of Canaan. The link between the two texts suggests that Enoch's story once framed how ancient writers understood the unseen world. Archaeologists and historians have long debated whether the legend of the giants reflected any real memory of prehistoric beings. The earliest copies of Enoch mention men of great stature, while later interpretations in the Book of Jubilees describe them as 3,000 cubits tall. That would equal over 4,000 feet, clearly mythic. Yet across the Near East, remains of oversized skeletal structures and massive stone tools have fueled speculation for centuries. In 1912, the German explorer Karl Weiner claimed to have found bones in the Bekaa Valley of Lebanon, larger than those of any known primate. The discovery was never verified, but it reawakened interest in the tradition that giants once walked the land between Mount Hermon and Bashan, the very region Enoch named as the Watcher's descent point. Mount Hermon itself appears repeatedly in apocryphal lore. Its name, derived from the Hebrew root herm, means to be banned or set apart. It was said that the 200 angels swore their oath upon its summit. Ancient Greek and Roman travelers recorded ruins on the mountain, describing cyclopean blocks and inscriptions in unknown scripts. To those familiar with Enoch's narrative, these stones became evidence of the giants' handiwork. In later centuries, stories of buried giants spread through the Mediterranean world. The historian Josephus, writing in the 1st century CE, claimed that the bones of the Nephilim were still displayed in Hebron during his time. The early Christian theologian Origen mentioned similar tales circulating in Arabia. By the Middle Ages, the myth had merged with local folklore. Bones of extinct animals were mistaken for those of sons of the Watchers, and medieval chroniclers recorded their discoveries as proof of scripture. But in the Enochian worldview, the giants were not merely physical anomalies. They represented a breach in the natural order. The knowledge their fathers had shared of metals, medicine, and writing became both a gift and a curse. The flood, therefore, was not only punishment, but reset. It erased a technological age that had advanced too far, too fast. Afterward, humanity began again with ignorance restored. In 1906, a copy of one Enoch in Guiers was examined by R. H. Charles, who translated its key passages into English. In one section, Enoch is shown the prisons where the Watchers are bound until the end of days. The location is described as under the hills of the earth, where the waters meet. Scholars have compared this to early Mesopotamian concepts of the Abzu, the watery underworld ruled by the god Enki. It suggests a continuity of myth older than the Hebrew texts themselves. Geologists studying the region of the Near East have noted that many of the flood traditions center around the same period, roughly 10,000 BCE, when melting glaciers caused rapid rises in sea level across the Mediterranean basin. Though the timing is not exact, the image of a world wiped clean by rising waters would have remained powerful among early peoples. In that sense, Enoch's flood may record a collective memory of environmental catastrophe layered with moral meaning. Yet it is the tone of the text that remains distinctive. Unlike later retellings, Enoch's flood is not narrated with despair or triumph. It is written with the same detached rhythm that defines the rest of the book, an observer recording events that have already happened many times. The destruction of the giants is not treated as a tragedy, but as the restoration of cosmic equilibrium The chapter ends with an image that has lingered through the centuries. Enoch sees the spirits of the Nephilim, restless and seeking form, condemned to inhabit the air. These shall rise against the sons of men until the day of consummation. In ancient Ethiopia, this line was once whispered during exorcisms. In the monasteries of Lake Tana, monks would recite Enoch's warnings beside the water's edge, believing that beneath the flood still slept the bones of the first rebellion. Across continents and centuries, the idea persists that something vast was buried beneath the deluge, not only bodies, but a history too dangerous to remember. In the quiet rhythm of Enoch's record, that buried world remains, waiting for its season to surface again. The angels in chains. After the flood, Enoch's vision turns downward to a world beneath the surface of the earth, where the beings who defied heaven were held in silence. These were the Watchers, 200 in number, once radiant, now bound. Their leader, Semjaza, and his closest followers, Azazel, Arachiel, Ramiel, and Kokabel, had crossed the threshold between heaven and earth and shared what was forbidden. In return, the judgment was absolute. They would be imprisoned until the final day, chained in darkness beneath mountains that trembled with their memory. The Book of Enoch describes their descent in a sequence of calm, mechanical sentences, without emotion or exaggeration. It reads as if transcribed from an official record. I saw there the prison of the angels who were bound, and I asked why this place was made. Enoch is guided by Uriel, one of the archangels. Uriel explains that this is the place of condemnation, a chamber prepared for the Watchers who betrayed their oath on Mount Hermon. Azazel, singled out above the rest, is said to have taught men to forge swords and armor, and women to adorn themselves with metals and pigment. The text claims that through him came war and vanity, and the world was corrupted through his knowledge. Uriel declares that Azazel shall be cast into the darkness, under sharp rocks, his face covered so that he may not see light. The location, described as a desert of Dudael, was later interpreted by scholars as somewhere near the Judean wilderness. Some traditions even claimed it lay beneath the Dead Sea, where salt plains and fissures mirror the description of burning, sterile ground. The image of chained angels would later evolve into the Christian vision of hell. The Greek term Tartarus, used in 2 Peter 2-4, appears nowhere else in the New Testament, but describes the same scene. God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but cast them into Tartarus and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness. It is a direct echo of Enoch's narrative, suggesting that early Christian writers treated the book as a source of cosmic geography. In Enoch's account, the 4 archangels, Michael, Uriel, Raphael, and Gabriel, carry out the sentence. Each has a specific task. Michael binds Semjaza and his host. Uriel announces judgment. Raphael heals the earth's corruption. Gabriel destroys the offspring of the Watchers. Their actions form the earliest version of celestial hierarchy, where divine justice is executed through precise, ordered command. The chains themselves are described as iron made from the fire of the stars. This phrase puzzled translators. The gaze word Basel implies both iron and meteorite, suggesting that the instruments of their imprisonment were forged from material fallen from the heavens, the same origin as the angels themselves. In the 19th century, scholar August Dillman noted that the passage might reflect ancient knowledge of meteoric iron, used in tools and weapons long before smelting was discovered. If true, Enoch's symbolism was rooted in early observation, the sky sending down metal, then reclaiming those who misused it. The imprisonment of the Watchers also explains a persistent silence, in later theology, the absence of multiple rebellious angels. In canonical scripture, only one, Lucifer, is remembered. Yet in Enoch, there were hundreds. Their removal from history was deliberate. Theologians of the 4th century considered Enoch's portrayal too complex, too plural. By simplifying rebellion into a single fall, the Church preserved the idea of a moral cosmos, ruled by clear opposites good and evil, heaven and hell without the uneasy detail of heavenly beings punished beneath the earth. Archaeological traces of this imagery appear across the Near East. In a limestone fragment discovered near Palmyra, dated to the 1st century CE, a figure bound in chains beneath winged beings is carved beside Aramaic letters spelling Irin, meaning watchers. In early Christian catacombs of Rome, frescoes show winged figures trapped in caves, their faces turned away from light. The scenes predate Dante's Inferno by more than a millennium. In the Ethiopian one Enoch, one verse describes Enoch witnessing pillars of flame descending from heaven to earth, where the angels were cast. Scholars have linked this to volcanic imagery, particularly the region around the Great Rift Valley, whose ancient eruptions may have inspired visions of divine punishment. To a world still unacquainted with geology, fire from the ground was the perfect mirror of rebellion from the sky. Yet Enoch's description of the imprisoned watchers is neither sensational nor moralizing. It reads like a record of containment. These are the angels who mingled with the daughters of men, and their spirits shall be confined until the end of all generations. There is no mention of torment, only confinement and eternal quarantine to prevent contamination of the world above. The text implies that their influence continued indirectly. The spirits of their offspring, unable to ascend or perish, were said to roam as tempters of humankind. In later centuries, rabbinical writings called them Shedim, beings of air, neither alive nor dead. Medieval commentators reinterpreted these as demons, yet in Enoch's framework they were echoes of knowledge that once existed, voices without form, remembering what had been lost. Fragments of the same story appear in Greek, Babylonian, and Persian myths. The Titans, imprisoned beneath Tartarus after their revolt, the Anunnaki, sent to the underworld for defying Enlil, the fallen devas of Zoroastrian lore all follow the same pattern: divine beings descending, sharing forbidden arts, punished beneath the earth. Enoch's narrative may have been the bridge that carried this pattern into later religions, translating cosmic rebellion into moral parable. In the caves near Qumran, fragments of the Book of Giants, a companion to Enoch, expand on these imprisonments. One piece describes the watcher Marwe travelling by dream to Enoch, begging for forgiveness, his words written in trembling. Another shows Enoch's reply delivered back through visions, an act that marks the first written communication between the imprisoned and the living. For the scribes of Qumran, these texts held authority equal to law. They were treated not as myth, but as history recorded before history began. The angels in chains became the foundation for how ancient cultures explained hidden power, earthquakes, volcanoes, thunder. Beneath mountains, something was bound. When it stirred, the earth trembled. Centuries later, when Christian monastics recited Enoch's passages, they imagined not devils, but beings waiting in silence for a forgotten command. Each tremor, each flash of lightning, was taken as a sign that one had moved slightly in its prison, testing the weight of the stars that bound it. The book that walked with God. Among the many voices that echo through early scripture, Enoch's is the one that never ends in death. The Genesis account gives only a single cryptic line: "And Enoch walked with God. Then he was not, for God took him." No explanation follows. It is neither miracle nor myth in the biblical text, only a brief erasure, as if a page was turned too quickly. Yet the book of Enoch fills that silence with detail: how a man was carried beyond the sky, shown the machinery of the cosmos, and transformed into something no longer human. According to the text, Enoch lived for 365 years, the same number of days in a solar year. Ancient interpreters saw meaning in that symmetry, believing his life mirrored the order of creation itself. In his visions, Enoch is lifted by the wind into the first heaven, where he sees walls built of crystal and tongues of flame. The space he enters is not a paradise of rest, but a domain of structure and light. Angels move in ordered ranks. The ground shines like frozen glass. He is told to write down all he witnesses, for no man before you has been shown these things. His ascent continues through multiple layers of heaven, each distinct. In the second, he observes imprisoned angels, those awaiting judgment. In the third, he sees the garden of righteousness, watered by 4 rivers and guarded by angelic beings of light. The fourth holds the sun and moon, moving within luminous chariots that trace the paths described earlier in the astronomical book. The fifth is the realm of the Watchers, still lamenting their fall. The sixth houses the angels who regulate the stars and record the deeds of men. Finally, in the seventh, he reaches the throne of the great glory, surrounded by choirs of flame and voices that measure creation in rhythm. Unlike later prophets, Enoch does not speak of salvation or worship. He functions as an observer, recording a universe built on precision. The throne, described as a structure of sapphire with wheels of fire beneath, recalls the visions of Ezekiel written centuries later. Some scholars suggest Ezekiel borrowed directly from this text, translating its imagery into his own account of divine machinery. Both describe a chariot of God surrounded by eyes, an image of omniscience rendered in mechanical form. In one of the most curious passages, Enoch is told to write 360 books containing the secrets of heaven and earth. These volumes, according to Ethiopian tradition, were sealed within the mountains before the flood. Only fragments are said to have survived echoes of knowledge concerning the stars, the movement of spirits, and the nature of the soul. Medieval mystics searching for these lost writings called them the Books of Measure, claiming they contained diagrams of creation. The transformation of Enoch into a heavenly being marks the climax of the narrative. He becomes Metatron, a figure later mentioned in Kabbalistic texts, the scribe of heaven. The third book of Enoch, composed centuries later in Hebrew, describes him as seated beside the divine throne, clothed in light, recording all that occurs in the worlds below. His body, once mortal, is said to emit 70,000 rays brighter than the Sunday. Though this later version belongs to a mystical era, it preserves the same idea found in the older text, a man elevated not by death, but by knowledge. The Qumran fragments confirm that the community saw Enoch not as myth, but as authority. They referred to him as the teacher of righteousness before the flood. In their scrolls, his writings were used to calculate the proper calendar and to interpret signs in the heavens. For them, Enoch represented an earlier priesthood, one uncorrupted by empire or temple politics. His disappearance into heaven was not a loss, but a withdrawal of divine truth from a world unready to receive it. Outside Judea, similar tales of mortal ascent appear. In Sumerian tradition, the king Etana was carried to heaven by an eagle to learn the secrets of kingship. In Greek myth, Ganymede is taken to Olympus to serve among the immortals. In early Persian texts, the prophet Yima is lifted into the sky after bringing law to men. Each shares a pattern, a mortal chosen, transported, and transformed by contact with divine order. But Enoch's version stands apart in tone. There is no celebration, no joy, only observation. His ascension is written with the same calm as a record of rainfall. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church preserves a reading that adds a single haunting detail. Before Enoch is taken, he is told to instruct his son Methuselah in the ways of righteousness, and to leave him the books of knowledge. Then, in the presence of his household, a cloud received him, and the angels carried him to the east. It is an image echoed later in Acts 1-9, when Christ ascends in similar fashion. For many early believers, Enoch's translation into heaven became the precedent for that later event, the first human lifted beyond the veil. In medieval manuscripts, scribes illustrated Enoch's journey as a spiral, a staircase rising into concentric heavens. Each step was labeled with a different order of angels: seraphim, cherubim, thrones, dominions, virtues, powers, principalities, archangels, angels. Though these hierarchies were codified long after Enoch's time, their structure reflects his influence. The very idea that heaven had levels, each with defined roles, began here. The final lines of the Book of Enoch's parables show him transformed. "And I, Enoch, was no longer as I had been before, for the Lord called me, and I was carried to the highest heaven." It is the earliest recorded ascension in Western religious literature, preceding both Elijah and Isaiah. To those who preserved his writings, Enoch's elevation was not myth, but evidence that knowledge could bridge heaven and earth. In 1773, when James Bruce brought the complete text from Ethiopia to Europe, readers noted the calm tone of its most extraordinary claim that a man had entered the mechanism of the universe and returned to write about it. Its neutrality made it unsettling. The book did not ask to be believed, it simply described. In that quiet description, Enoch's voice endures, a record of a traveller who walked with God and vanished not into death, but into data, into the precise and ordered memory of the stars. The forbidden calendar. In the heart of the Book of Enoch lies a system of time mathematical, ordered, and profoundly out of step with every calendar that followed. To its author, this calendar was not invention, but revelation. The 364-day year he describes was presented as the true measure of creation, dictated by the rhythm of the heavens themselves. Every quarter held 91 days, divided into weeks of 7, completing a perfect cycle of 52 weeks exactly. It was a model of symmetry unbroken, repeating, eternal. Yet that same perfection made it dangerous. In Enoch's account, the angel Uriel is assigned as his teacher in this secret of time. The sun, the moon, and the stars are all ordered by this number, Uriel tells him. The 4 quarters were said to align with the portals of the sky, the gates through which light and wind passed in equal measure. To observe any other reckoning, Enoch was warned, would bring chaos. For the sinners will err in counting the days, and the seasons will be disturbed, and the sun will set out of its course. The warning reads less like poetry and more like law, a cosmic decree that timekeeping itself carried moral weight. In Jerusalem, however, a different calendar was already in use. By the 2nd century BCE, the priestly classes of the temple followed a lunar year of roughly 354 days, periodically adjusted with intercalary months. This was the Babylonian system, adopted after the exile. It allowed the festivals to align with the moon's phases, but introduced irregularity. Months drifted, years required correction. For the sects that revered Enoch's writings, this was corruption. They believed sacred observances had been shifted from their proper seasons. In their view, the temple priests had lost alignment with heaven. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls, fragments of texts, like the Book of Jubilees and the Temple Scroll, show that the Qumran community tried to restore Enoch's solar calendar. They began each year on the 4th day of the week, the day, they believed, when the sun, moon, and stars were created. Their festivals followed fixed intervals: Passover on the 14th day of the 1st month, the Feast of Weeks on the 15th day of the 3rd, the Day of Atonement on the 10th day of the 7th. In their system, no feast ever fell on the Sabbath. No month began under a dark moon. It was a calendar built for consistency, not convenience. The conflict between the two systems was more than arithmetic, it was political. Time defined power. Whoever controlled the calendar decided when the people gathered, when sacrifices were offered, when debt was released, when the year itself began. By rejecting the lunar calendar, the Enochian sects rejected the temple's authority. Their texts accused the priests of confusing the order of days, of turning worship into disorder. Some scholars suggest that this disagreement was one reason their writings were sealed in caves around 68 CE as Roman forces approached. The scrolls were not just scripture, they were protest. The forbidden calendar also reveals an advanced understanding of solar motion for its era. Enoch's 364-day model may have been derived from observations of the equinoxes at a fixed latitude, possibly near Mount Hermon or northern Mesopotamia. It maintains balance within a single degree of error, remarkable precision for a system described 2,000 years before modern astronomy. The use of quarter divisions suggests practical observation of the solstices, marked by sunrise points along fixed horizons. In this sense, the calendar was not mystical, it was empirical. Yet what made it heretical was not its accuracy, but its origin. Enoch claimed it was taught by Uriel, an angel set over the world and over Tartarus. The knowledge, therefore, bypassed human discovery. It belonged to the forbidden sciences once shared by the Watchers. For later theologians, this association was enough to disqualify it. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE would later fix Easter, according to a lunar computation, an indirect continuation of the system Enoch had opposed. From that point onward, the solar calendar of Enoch was erased from orthodoxy. When James Bruce's Ethiopian manuscripts reached Europe in the late 18th century, the calendar passages drew quiet fascination. They described a time structure that echoed both Egyptian and early Mesopotamian systems, yet claimed precedence over all. Scholars noted that the Enochian year of 364 days divided evenly into weeks, preventing the Sabbath from drifting through the months. Some suggested that the structure hinted at an earlier priestly calendar from before the Babylonian captivity. Others thought it purely symbolic, a model of divine order, rather than actual chronology. In 1956, fragments of the astronomical book found at Qumran confirmed that the sect's daily prayers were tied to the rising and setting of the sun, according to this same pattern. The scroll designated certain gates of the sky, for each month 12, in all corresponding to the sun's position along the horizon. Each quarter contained an equinox, dividing light and darkness equally. The rhythm was geometric, not lunar. Every sunrise was a measurement, every sunset a verification. Enoch's text links this pattern directly to morality. When time loses its balance, so does the world. Crops fail, floods increase, rulers fall. It is not superstition, but a cosmology in which human order reflects celestial order. The corruption of time becomes the root of all decay. This idea would echo centuries later in apocalyptic literature, where the end of days is described as a disruption of cycles. The sun darkened, the moon turned to blood, the stars falling from heaven. To Enoch, such collapse was not destruction, but the final misalignment of an abandoned clock. In the monasteries of Ethiopia, the 364-day calendar persisted quietly for nearly 2 millennia. The Coptic and Ethiopian liturgical years still retain traces of its structure, beginning with the month of Magabit and observing festivals in fixed solar intervals. Local monks have long called it Ye Eno Zeman, the time of Enoch. To them it was never forbidden, only forgotten elsewhere. To modern historians, the Enochian calendar stands as one of the earliest attempts to impose mathematical order on sacred life. It represents a view of the cosmos in which time itself is divine architecture, an invisible temple renewed with every dawn. And perhaps for that reason, it was excluded. Its perfection left no room for human correction. It remains a quiet riddle, a year that never drifts, a calendar written by angels, and a reminder that even time, once measured too precisely, can become a threat to power. The flooded archives. In one of the more obscure sections of the Book of Enoch, there is mention of something hidden before the world was washed clean. The text states that Enoch wrote all things down for the generations of men, and placed them within the earth. The words are brief, almost unnoticeable among visions and parables, yet their meaning extends far beyond the surface. They imply that before the flood, Enoch sealed his records, books of knowledge, astronomy, and judgment inside mountains where the waters would not reach. For centuries, this quiet sentence has fed a question few have been willing to ask directly. If Enoch's writings existed before the deluge, where are they now? The idea of pre-flood archives was not unique to Enoch. The historian Josephus, writing in the 1st century CE, claimed that the descendants of Seth, Adam's third son, built 2 pillars to preserve knowledge of the stars, one of brick, one of stone, so that at least one would survive fire or water. He identified their ruins as still standing in the land of Siriad, an ancient term for Egypt. Some have seen this as a direct echo of Enoch's act. Both accounts speak of knowledge safeguarded against cosmic disaster, preserved not by chance, but by design. In Enoch's writings, the knowledge at risk was specific: measurements of the heavens, the cycles of light and shadow, and the laws that govern celestial movement. He feared that these would vanish when the waters rise above the highest hills. The text implies that certain locations, mountains whose peaks pierced the firmament, would remain dry. These were chosen as vaults for his scrolls. Later traditions place them in regions near Mount Ararat or Mount Hermon, where early Armenian legends also describe stone chests buried by the ancients before the flood. When early European explorers reached the highlands of Ethiopia, they encountered monastic libraries holding manuscripts that local priests called Metzahef, Enoch, the books of Enoch. Many of these copies contained marginal notes describing earlier copies lost in the waters of the First Age. Whether symbolic or not, the idea of an unbroken transmission from before the flood became a cornerstone of Ethiopian sacred history. In 1892, a scholar named August Dillman examined one such manuscript in Axum. He noted a passage absent from earlier Western translations. "And the Lord said unto me, Hide the books in the earth, for the generations to come, that they may discover them in their season." Dillman suggested that this addition may have derived from local oral tradition, a memory of hidden archives believed to await rediscovery. Similar stories appear in Mesopotamian sources. The Epic of Gilgamesh opens with a line claiming that the hero saw the deep and knew all things, and brought back the story of the time before the flood. Scholars note that ancient Babylonian kings, including Ashurbanipal of Nineveh, collected clay tablets of these flood accounts as early as the 7th century BCE. In his inscriptions, Ashurbanipal boasted that he could read the writings from before the flood, implying that such texts existed and were considered relics of a forgotten age. Thousands of tablets from his library survive today, detailing astronomy, medicine, and myth. They mirror the same impulse that Enoch's narrative records to preserve knowledge from erasure. Some modern researchers suggest that these flood stories reflect a real geological memory. During the end of the last ice age, around 10,000 BCE, glacial melt and rapid sea level rise transformed entire landscapes. Settlements near ancient shorelines would have vanished underwater within generations. In that context, the notion of preserving learning in high ground makes sense. Mountains and caves became natural repositories, safe from the waters that erased the plains. Archaeological discoveries have occasionally revived speculation about such antediluvian vaults. In 1927, excavations at Mount Bastan in Iran revealed chambers containing tablets describing astronomical cycles older than the Persian Empire. In 1945, in Upper Egypt, the Nag Hammadi codices texts buried in sealed jars were uncovered near a monastery. Though written centuries later, their method of preservation paralleled Enoch's description: hidden knowledge waiting for an appointed time. For the Qumran community, which copied Enoch's works, this concept was central. Their own library, sealed in caves above the Dead Sea, was designed as a time capsule for an age of restoration. The placement of the scrolls within jars, deep in rock fissures, suggests deliberate imitation of the books in the earth that Enoch described. The Dead Sea Scrolls themselves, found after 2 millennia, may therefore represent the reenactment of an older ritual of concealment. The Greek philosopher Plato, writing in Timaeus and Critias, mentions Egyptian priests telling Solon of records preserved in temples from before the Great Flood. He describes libraries built to withstand water and fire, and a civilization that perished when the sea reclaimed its plains. Whether myth or inherited memory, this account shares the same pattern as Enoch's: knowledge buried to outlast disaster. In medieval Europe, legends persisted of subterranean chambers holding the 7 books of Enoch. A 14th century Latin chronicle from Cologne claimed that one such vault existed beneath the Caucasus Mountains, discovered briefly during the reign of Emperor Heraclius, but sealed again after a sudden quake. No evidence supports it, yet the story circulated for centuries, merging with tales of hidden libraries beneath Alexandria and secret archives beneath the Giza Plateau. Modern interpretations of Enoch's flooded archives vary. Some read them symbolically, as metaphors for wisdom preserved in spiritual form knowledge that resurfaces when humanity is ready. Others take the passages literally, linking them to archaeological anomalies, megalithic ruins found at high elevations, or unexplained chambers beneath ancient temples. In 1963, researchers exploring Mount Hermon's lower slopes reported sealed stone niches resembling tombs but containing no bodies, only layers of ash and pottery dust. The discovery was never followed up, though local folklore identified the mountain as the place of oath, echoing Enoch's narrative. What matters, in the rhythm of Enoch's writing, is not the proof, but the intention. To write something so that it may be read after the world's destruction is to believe that time itself can be defeated by memory. His act recording, sealing, burying foreshadows every later archive, from the clay tablets of Sumer to the magnetic tapes of modern civilization. Each reflects the same quiet defiance, that knowledge once given must not vanish. In this way, the flood becomes less an event of punishment and more an event of preservation. Beneath the waters, Enoch's words wait trapped between myth and geology, between memory and stone. The silence of his archives continues, not as legend, but as a pattern repeated wherever people hide their learning from the storms that come too soon. The parables of the hidden sun. In the later chapters of the Book of Enoch, what scholars now call the parables or similitudes, the narrative shifts in tone. It becomes less concerned with stars, seasons, or angelic punishments, and more with a mysterious figure who appears repeatedly under a single title, the Son of Man. This portion of the text was long unknown in the West. The copies found among the Dead Sea Scrolls omit it entirely, and for centuries the section survived only in the Ethiopian manuscript. When it was finally translated into English in the 19th century, its language startled scholars. It spoke of a divine judge, a chosen one who pre-existed creation, who would one day sit beside the throne of the great glory and preside over the judgment of kings. The description was older than the Gospels, yet strikingly familiar. In the first parable, Enoch is taken to a high place, from which he sees the dwelling of the holy ones and the resting places of the righteous. There, he beholds a figure unlike any angel or man he has seen. The passage reads, "And there I saw one who had a head of days, and his countenance was full of grace, like that of a man." Uriel explains that this is the elect one, chosen before the sun and stars were made, hidden until the time of judgment. The word hidden repeats often. It suggests not absence, but waiting, a concept that recurs throughout ancient Near Eastern prophecy. where divine figures withdraw from the world to return at an appointed hour. In the second parable, this being is called the Son of Man. The text declares that he shall be a staff for the righteous and the light of the Gentiles. These phrases, centuries later, would appear in the Christian Gospels applied to Jesus of Nazareth. Yet the Enochian text predates those writings by at least a century. Scholars have debated whether the Gospels drew from Enoch or whether both emerged from a shared apocalyptic tradition in the region. Either way, the resemblance is undeniable. The Ethiopian version preserves a passage that reads, "Before the sun and the signs were created, his name was named in the presence of the Lord of spirits." This implies eternal existence, a being who was, from the beginning, known by name. In later Christian theology, this would become the cornerstone of pre-existence, the idea that the Messiah existed before birth. But in Enoch's quiet phrasing, it is presented without doctrine, simply as observation. The Son of Man was there before the lights of heaven were lit. When the parables were examined by 20th century scholars, they noted that its structure differed from the rest of the book. The language, while still ancient, reflected a period of intense expectation in Jewish society between the Maccabean revolt and the rise of Rome, when foreign empires ruled Judea and prophetic silence seemed to stretch too long. In that setting, the figure of a pre-existent Redeemer who would bring justice to the oppressed had deep political and spiritual resonance. The third parable expands the vision into cosmic scale. Enoch sees the Ancient of Days, seated upon a throne of glory, surrounded by countless hosts of light. Before him stands the Son of Man, to whom authority is given over kings and mighty ones. He shall overthrow the sinners from the face of the earth, the text says, and the kings shall be frightened, and darkness shall fall upon them. This dual presence, one ancient, one youthful, would later inform Christian iconography of the Father and the Son. Yet in the Enochian context, the relationship is undefined. The Son of Man is neither subordinate nor separate. He is described as the embodiment of divine judgment, chosen and concealed, existing within the great glory as both servant and reflection. This ambiguity troubled later theologians. When early church councils determined which texts would form the canon, the parables of Enoch were excluded, perhaps because they blurred the line between Jewish prophecy and what would become Christian doctrine. To Jewish scribes, the idea of a divine man seated beside God was unacceptable. To early Christians, a text naming their Messiah centuries before his birth presented theological risk. It implied that revelation existed outside the emerging gospel narrative. For that reason, the parables vanished from Western circulation after the 4th century. In Ethiopia, however, they remained in use. Monks there copied them into illuminated manuscripts, often depicting the Son of Man as a radiant figure standing beside a wheel of stars. One 15th century codex, preserved in the monastery of Lake Hake, shows Enoch bowing before two thrones of equal height, one empty, one occupied by a figure whose hands emit beams of light. Beneath the image, the Ge'ez caption reads, "The chosen one shall rise from among men and dwell forever beside the Lord of spirits." Modern scholars have called this section the most dangerous book never canonized. In it, divine authority no longer belongs solely to the unseen. Judgment is entrusted to a being who shares human form, linking heaven's order with the fate of earth. The text closes with Enoch being told to record all he has seen. "Write down all the hidden things that I have shown you, for the generations to come will inquire." His task is unchanged, to preserve what should not yet be known. Archaeologists and theologians continue to debate the origin of these passages. Some propose that the parables were written between 50 BCE and 30 CE, overlapping the early years of Roman rule in Judea. Others argue for an earlier date, placing them in the Hasmonean period. Regardless of their age, they stand as the earliest known text to use Son of Man as a title of divine authority. That phrase would later define entire religions, but here it remains quiet, unnamed, waiting. In the calm rhythm of Enoch's writing, the revelation does not end in triumph. It ends in stillness. The Son of Man takes his seat beside the Ancient of Days. The stars resume their courses, and Enoch, scribe of the unseen, returns to his place among the living. The vision fades not with prophecy, but with silence. The judgment of the kings. In the latter pages of the Book of Enoch, the tone becomes colder, slower, and more deliberate. Enoch no longer observes the mechanics of the sky or the rise and fall of angels. Instead, he is shown what happens when human empires themselves are weighed. In this section, known to scholars as the Apocalypse of Weeks, Enoch witnesses the judgment of the kings, the rulers of the earth summoned before a throne of light. It is not the chaos of the flood or the rebellion of the watchers that fills these lines, but the quiet reckoning of power itself. The scene opens in the same restrained language found throughout the book. And I saw a great throne set upon the crystal streams, and upon it sat the great glory. Before him were gathered all the kings, and the mighty, and the exalted, who dwell upon the earth. There is no fire, no noise, no battle. Instead, there are books. Enoch writes that the books of the living were opened before him, and each ruler's deeds were measured like weights upon a scale. To the ancient reader, this imagery was familiar. Babylonian and Egyptian traditions had long described judgment as a balance between truth and corruption. But Enoch's vision makes the process mechanical. The throne is surrounded by recorders' angels who write and read without emotion. They turn pages of light, each containing the pattern of a life. The kings do not speak in defense. Their nations do not stand beside them. The judgment is not collective, but personal. Each was measured by the number of the poor he had destroyed and by the blood of the innocent that cried from the ground. This passage, copied by later scribes and gays, reads less like prophecy and more like ledger, an audit of rule. There is no mention of hellfire or eternal torment, only exclusion. They shall not rise from their thrones again, for their crowns have fallen. Enoch's weeks divide human history into a sequence of 7 ages. The first weeks belong to innocence, the time of Adam, Seth, and the early patriarchs. The middle weeks belong to corruption and war. The final week, the 7th, is called the week of judgment, when the righteous shall see the heavenly temple revealed. Within this framework, Enoch sees the kings of the earth, who ruled unjustly, brought before the throne of glory. The structure is mathematical. Each era is a unit of time. Each generation corresponds to a change in the divine record. The world, in this system, does not end in catastrophe, but in bookkeeping. When the scrolls of Enoch resurfaced at Qumran, fragments of this section were found among the jars. In one, written in the familiar hand of the Essene scribes, the line appears, "And the scribe of righteousness read before the Lord of spirits the record of kings." It implies that divine judgment was conceived as a literal reading of history. Heaven, in this view, is not an emotion, it is an archive. Scholars who studied the Apocalypse of Weeks noted its parallels with later apocalyptic literature. The Book of Daniel, composed centuries later, describes a near identical scene. The thrones were set, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. The similarity is so precise that some suggest Daniel's author drew directly from Enoch's writings. The difference lies in tone. Daniel's account anticipates deliverance. Enoch's does not. His vision ends without verdict or redemption. The kings vanish into the silence of the court, and the books remain open. Throughout history, rulers were measured against this image of the throne. Early Christian teachers cited Enoch to remind emperors that their power was temporary. The Ethiopian Kebra Nagast, written more than 1,000 years later, includes echoes of the same vision. For the kings who oppress shall be judged by the book that burns with no flame. Even the Quran, composed in the 7th century CE, reflects a similar motif. And the record shall be laid open, and thou shalt see the guilty fearful of what is therein, whether by direct borrowing or inherited tradition. The concept of the divine archive, originating in Enoch, shaped how the ancient world imagined accountability. The Apocalypse of Weeks also contains a rare mention of written law before Moses. Enoch is shown tablets of heaven, upon which the deeds of the children of men were written before they came into being. This idea that every act was inscribed before its occurrence introduces an early form of determinism. Time, to Enoch, is a structure that records itself as it unfolds. The kings, therefore, are not judged for accidents, but for deviations from a pattern already known. The judgment is not emotional, but procedural. In the Ge'ez manuscripts kept at Lake Tana, monks still recite portions of this section during Lent. Their chant is slow, almost whispered, repeating the phrase, "The books were opened." Each repetition marks not fear, but reflection. The judgment of kings to them is ongoing. Every generation adds new names to the record, and none can erase the old. When the British Orientalist R.H. Charles translated the text in 1912, he remarked on its neutrality. The Apocalypse of Enoch contains no hope of restoration for the wicked, only the assurance that all things are observed. Later readers would recognize this as one of the earliest depictions of moral order existing beyond religion. It presents the universe as a place where nothing is forgotten, where justice is not enforced by fire but by memory. No thunder follows this revelation. The passage ends with Enoch standing before the throne, silent. The angelic scribes close the books, and the court disperses into light. He is told to record what he has seen, but not to interpret it. For the meaning, says the voice beside him, is for those who come after. In that silence, the judgment remains suspended. The kings, their empires long dust, are remembered only as names in a book that, according to Enoch, still lies open in heaven. And with each turn of history, new lines are written beside the old ones, the ink unchanging, the ledger eternal, the fire beneath the mountains. In one of Enoch's later visions, his guide leads him away from the luminous halls of heaven and down through the strata of the world below. The voice that once spoke of stars now describes rock, heat, and metal. This is the passage that later translators called the Vision of the Seven Mountains of Fire. It stands apart from the rest of the book, neither celestial nor moral, but geological. Enoch becomes a surveyor, recording a landscape that glows from within. The text begins simply, "And I saw 7 mountains of magnificent stones, each different from the other." The description that follows reads less like myth and more like topography. The first mountain is said to be of iron, the second of copper, the third of silver, the fourth of gold, the fifth of soft metal, the sixth of molten glass, and the seventh, beyond all fragrance, shining brighter than snow. From its summit issues a stream of fire that flows toward the west. Enoch's guide identifies it as the river of punishment for the stars that transgressed their paths. To later readers, these mountains became symbols 7 ages of the world, or 7 sins, or 7 kingdoms. But the original passage offers no interpretation. It reads like a report, calm and deliberate. Each mountain, Enoch notes, emitted sound. They sang in heat. The phrase puzzled scholars until comparisons were made to descriptions of volcanic vents and fumaroles. In ancient Mesopotamian cosmology, mountains that burned were seen as gates to the underworld. To Enoch, they were the visible edges of the same prisons he had glimpsed earlier, the places where fallen beings were confined. Modern historians date this portion of the text to between 200 and 100 BCE. The imagery aligns closely with the geography of the Levant, where chains of extinct volcanoes stretch from the Golan Heights to the northern deserts. Mount Hermon, the site of the Watcher's descent, lies within this same arc. Ancient observers, watching smoke rise from fissures in the earth, would have seen in it a continuation of the heavenly story, rebellious stars buried under molten stone. Enoch's guide names one of these regions the west of the Great Sea. The wording corresponds to the Rift Valley's alignment toward the Mediterranean. Within its description, he sees lakes of burning metal images that resemble natural asphalt pits and sulfur springs found near the Dead Sea. Greek writers later referred to that region as asphaltites, a place where fire and mineral intermingled. The Book of the Watchers predates these accounts, but captures the same environment. The text does not call these mountains evil. It calls them the foundations of the earth. They are functional, part of the design. Fire circulates through them as blood through veins, maintaining balance between upper and lower worlds. The prisons of the angels are not chaos, but containment heat as order. Here the winds are weighed, Enoch writes, and the rivers are measured. To him the earth is not static, it breathes through stone. In one passage, he sees chambers filled with glowing metal, flowing without end. His guide explains that these are the treasuries of the elements, reserved for the day when the earth shall be renewed. Later, apocalyptic texts reused this image. The idea that mountains hold the resources for both destruction and rebirth. Medieval theologians would call these the seven furnaces of creation, interpreting them as metaphors for the purification of the world by fire. But in Enoch's original vision, there is no allegory, only temperature and colour. When the Book of Enoch reached Europe, natural philosophers noticed the precision of its mineral description. The 18th century geologist Johann Lehmann remarked that the author must have stood in sight of volcanic country. Some even speculated that the seven mountains referred to the volcanic islands of the Aegean or the highlands of Armenia, where obsidian, gold, and copper veins still converge. The order of metals iron, copper, silver, gold mirrors the sequence found in early metallurgical traditions, suggesting a familiarity with mining long before the known Bronze Age. A fragment from Qumran expands the scene, and there were mountains whose roots reached into the deep places, and beneath them, fire dwelt like a living thing. The phrasing suggests the ancient intuition of an internal heat beneath the crust, a concept later echoed in Greek natural philosophy. Anaximander would write of fire in the earth's womb, and Heraclitus spoke of earth that turns into fire and fire into sea. Enoch's version predates both by centuries. The vision concludes with a return to the surface. Enoch describes being led back through a valley of darkness, where pillars of smoke rose from fissures. His guide tells him, "These are the limits of the world. Beyond them, the firmament curves downward, and the stars sink into the horizon's edge." To later mystics, this was the border between the visible and the concealed, the place where divine punishment met natural process. The monks who preserved the Ge'ez version read this chapter during Lent, when the earth's renewal was a symbol of repentance. Their commentaries call the mountains the bones of the world. In their quiet language, the fiery foundations became not a warning but a reminder that the ground beneath them was alive, watched, and measured. To modern readers, Enoch's vision of molten mountains can be read as mythology, as geology, or as something between the two, a record of the earth seen through the eyes of a man who believed that even stone obeyed divine law. The rivers of fire, the treasuries of metal, the foundations that hum each is part of a larger pattern, a mechanical universe, where punishment and renewal share the same heat. And when the text ends, there is no closure, only a single sentence that returns to silence. "And there I saw the spirits of the stars imprisoned until the day when the earth shall give up her fire, the book that was not supposed to return. In 1773, a Scottish traveller named James Bruce walked down from the Ethiopian highlands carrying 3 leather-bound manuscripts. They were written in Ge'ez, the ancient liturgical language of Ethiopia, and they contained something the Western world had forgotten for more than 1,000 years, the complete Book of Enoch. When Bruce reached Europe, scholars met him with disbelief. They examined the pages by lamplight, uncertain of what they were seeing. The book mentioned names found nowhere else, spoke of heavens layered like machinery, and described a human being who had walked among angels before the flood. It contradicted the order of Scripture, yet every line carried the cadence of something older than translation. The first printed edition appeared in Oxford in 1821. Its translator, Richard Lawrence, noted that the tone was unlike any other sacred text, calm, factual, almost indifferent to its own miracles. The voice did not argue or persuade. It simply recorded. Enoch, Lawrence wrote, is the witness of an age that was erased. Within months, theologians began to call the discovery dangerous. It predated the book of Genesis in detail, yet referenced it as if already known. It described astronomical systems that aligned with ancient Babylonian observation, but were attributed to divine instruction. And it contained a messianic figure, a son of man enthroned beside the Ancient of Days, written centuries before the Gospels. The boundaries of canon and heresy, fixed for over a millennium, began to blur. The question arose, why was this book removed? The Council of Laodicea had excluded it in the 4th century, listing it among writings not to be read in church. But no explicit condemnation survived. It was not declared false, it was merely set aside, its voice made silent by omission. Some historians suggest that its visions were too detailed, too mechanical, heaven as machinery, angels as measurable beings, judgment as record, a universe built not on faith but on observation. In the quiet monasteries of Ethiopia, no such boundary existed. There, the Book of Enoch had been copied continuously for 2,000 years, treated not as forbidden, but as preserved memory. Monks recited its passages during solstice observances, timing prayer with the sun's position, the same 364-day rhythm the book described. In their eyes, the rediscovery in Europe was not revelation, but return. Modern scholars, tracing its survival, found evidence of a narrow thread, from Jewish scribes of the Second Temple period to early Christian mystics, then through Coptic translations into the Ge'ez manuscripts of the Ethiopian Church. Each generation had quietly protected a text the rest of the world had buried. When the printing presses of Europe revived it, the circle closed. The book that was hidden under earth, sealed in mountains, passed through deserts and monasteries, had surfaced again, and it carried questions that still have not been answered. The oldest fragments, found among the Dead Sea Scrolls in the caves of Qumran, match the Ethiopian text almost word for word. This means the copy preserved in isolation for 2 millennia remained intact while empires fell and languages changed. To historians, this is a statistical impossibility. To theologians, it is proof of something intentional. In either case, the book's endurance feels deliberate, as though it was meant to vanish and then reappear at a specific time. When Enoch himself writes of the future, he describes a generation of light who shall search for the words written in darkness. That phrase, long considered symbolic, now reads like description. The rediscovery in 1773 was followed by a century of exploration, archaeologists uncovering buried tablets, scholars translating forgotten scripts, telescopes mapping the same stars Enoch described in his ascent. Knowledge, once forbidden, became curiosity. In the 20th century, fragments of the book emerged again from Qumran's dust, written not in Ge'ez, but in Aramaic, the language Enoch's first readers would have known. They proved that the book was not medieval invention, but ancient record. Radiocarbon dating placed the parchment around the 2nd century BCE, nearly 2,000 years older than its rediscovery. What had been dismissed as myth had, in physical form, returned from the earth precisely as the book itself predicted its own preservation. It is easy, in the modern age, to call this coincidence. Yet Enoch's story resists dismissal. He is the first human said to have recorded the structure of the universe, the first to describe orbits and gates of light, the first to link moral order with celestial motion. His writing marks the point where myth became observation, and it was that boundary, perhaps, that frightened those who built the official timeline of history. When the book was banned, entire cosmologies vanished with it. The heavens lost their machinery, angels became abstract, and divine judgment turned personal. The rediscovery, in 1773, reopened those older possibilities, the idea that early humanity may have inherited scientific patterns rather than invented them. The text does not shout this. It merely suggests, in its measured rhythm, that knowledge once flowed downward before rising again. In 1976, fragments of Enoch's Book of Luminaries were examined under infrared light at the Shrine of the Book in Jerusalem. The script, nearly invisible to the eye, revealed corrections, tiny marks that aligned perfectly with solar cycles known only through modern astronomy. Whoever copied the original text had calculated the year's length with extraordinary precision. It was not speculation, it was measurement. Yet the book never claims authorship. Enoch disappears as quietly as he appears. And he was not, for God took him. The man vanishes, but the record remains. Across every translation, every version, one idea stays constant, that the words themselves were meant to outlast the world that wrote them. Today, scholars file it under Apocrypha. Churches rarely mention it, but the patterns it describes still mirror the sky. The number of days, the rhythm of the solstices, the relationship between moon and sun, all remain unchanged. The universe continues to operate by the same system the book recorded long ago. Perhaps that is why the Book of Enoch was not destroyed, only delayed. It waited, buried under language, under councils, under time, until the world was once again willing to read a universe that required no belief, only observation. And when it returned, it did not arrive with prophecy or flame. It came, as it always had, quiet, unhurried, and written in the language of order. The book that was not supposed to return simply turned another page. Across centuries, it waited, buried in caves, whispered through fragments, preserved by those who refused to forget. The Book of Enoch is not just an ancient record, it is a memory of a world before the flood, before written history, before time was measured by kings. Its return reminds us that knowledge, once hidden, always finds its way back. The story does not end here. In vaults, in ruins, in languages no longer spoken, other lost books still wait for their season to be read again. Join us as we continue to trace the shadows of forgotten civilizations, banned scriptures, and the mysteries that refuse to die. Subscribe, stay curious, and step quietly into the next chapter of history, where every secret once buried is waiting to be unearthed.